right, so we're going to start our ancient Greece unit. One of the things about ancient Greece is so many of the things that they have invented, started, or created. And so that's how the reading actually started, was talking about the contributions of the ancient Greeks and how much they've contributed to our world. One of the main areas that they have contributed to our world is, of course, in language, especially in the areas of science, medical, and technical fields. Actually, Greek is a basis for English, and 1 in 8 words are Greek. So the examples that were given in the book, and notice the word language and Greek as a basis for English, and all of these words are in orange. So those are talking about the contributions, the things that they've invented or started that we use. So you've got words like panic, atom, architecture, democracy, not only the word democracy, but the idea of democracy, ethics, logic, myth, nectar, alphabet. The word alphabet itself is combining the Greek letters of A and B, alpha and beta. Theme, psychology, or anything that ends in ology. Achilles' heel, the Hippocratic Oath. So once again, 1 in 8 words. Besides contributing language, they've also contributed a lot of how we use reasoning, how we think, and anytime that we're talking about anytime we're talking about Hellenic history, Hellenic science, Hellenic philosophy, we're referring to Greek history, Greek philosophy. And so the word Hellenic and Hellenes comes from the Greeks' name for their own country of Hellas. So Hellenes are Greeks, and Hellenic is referring to anything about Greek culture. Notice I have drama in orange. Really, philosophy should be in orange. Parts of history should be in orange. Parts of medicine, parts of math, and parts of science. But we'll be more specific later on. All right, besides language and how to reason and think, art and architecture are another area of contributions. They, of course, built lots of temples, but they weren't the first people to do that. But in their temples, they used the architectural feature of columns. And they came up with 3 different kinds of columns. And so you're going to need to write these down as well. The most simplistic is the Doric. And all 3 of the columns have the same structure, but it's the capital. It's this top part that's different. And so the Doric is the most simplistic. And so you can see here that it was in the Parthenon construction, another temple found in Athens, and then in the United States, it's at they're used at the front of the Carnegie Library. The Ionic is the next one, and once again, simple column, but it's the capital part that is more detailed. This one has swirls both at the right and the left side of the column. And here you can see the Temple of Athens or Athena. And then this one is here again in the United States at the Little Rock Zion Church. And the most complex and detailed is called Corinthian. And the Corinthian is very detailed at the top. It has flowery type designs, leaf type designs. And here you can see it was in a temple in Rome. And then this is in the Charlotte City Hall, that they are the Corinthian style. All right, so back to our notes. Besides the idea of columns, they also used a lot of perfection in their art. So instead of depicting people like they really looked, they made them look super muscular. They didn't have a big nose. They wouldn't have wrinkles. They wouldn't have a receding hairline. So not only did they portray humans as perfect in sculptures, but their gods as well. And they thought of their gods as being perfect. In buildings and in other things, they use symmetry, order, balance, and elegance. A lot of their sculptures and architecture were made out of marble, so it was very elegant. And that's part of the reason why it exists even today. Symmetry just simply means that the right side looks like the left side, the front side looks like the back side. And we'll talk about that more when we get into other buildings. All right, so let's get a little geography. The Greeks were Indo-European Caucasians that lived on the Balkan Peninsula, which is where present-day Greece is and where ancient Greece was, and it was along the Aegean Sea. Now, actually, Greece was a peninsula, so therefore it was surrounded on three sides by water, but the Aegean was kind of in the center of the Greek world. Now, it was really unusual that they lived here simply because it was not the fertile land along rivers like other ancient civilizations. It was really in mountainous land that really wasn't great for farming. They did farm, but really they mostly focused on being, dealing with the sea, being sea oriented. What they did grow and they exported olives for olive oil, certain grains, grapes, and then of course using those grapes for wine. They have a moderate climate. It's called the Mediterranean climate, and that's because the other side of the peninsula is along the Mediterranean Sea, and this just means it is sunny most days of the year, and so they spent a lot of their time in the out of doors. So when you're looking at this picture here, you can see the rocky cliff sides of ancient Greece and modern day Greece. And you can kind of see here, here's what Greece looked like around 1400 BC. You can see the Aegean Sea is in the center of their world. All right, so on your maps, let's label the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea because they were critical to the survival of ancient Greece and modern day Greece. All right, as I mentioned, they spent most of their time outside. They were outside in amphitheaters like the picture on this page, and those are outdoor arenas. They had plays and performances here. They did some sporting events here. They would have public and political speeches here. And it was, an arena that is very similar to ours today, with the exception it was usually a semicircle instead of a full circle or oval arena like we're used to. They also shopped in the out of doors. They spent a lot of time at the wharf along the seas. In the assembly, which is the Greek lawmaking body, they met in the out of doors, and they would work out outside as well. So their gymnasium didn't really, it wasn't a building like we would portray ours. All right, so there's a couple of groups of people that we want to talk about in the evolution of ancient Greek civilization. The first one, from 2500 to 1500 BC, lived on the island of Crete, and the capital was Knossos. And so you're going to need to know those two locations. And if you look at page 110, it shows you where the island of Crete is and where the city of Knossos was. The leader, the king, the monarch was known as Minos, and this was a group of people that was well known for its courageous behaviors, its brave actions, and they would do things like leaping over bulls to show their courage when it was coming at them, their strength to grab their horns, and their agility to jump and leap up over them. And that was kind of a basis for how we expect Greeks to behave, and that's why they created the Olympics. They also had a modern plumbing system, and we're not really sure what caused the Minoan civilization to end. Was it a foreign invasion? Was it some natural disaster like a volcanic explosion? Maybe an earthquake that also caused tidal wave? Maybe a little bit of both or a combination of any of these, but they ended in 1500 BC. So this is group number one, the Minoans. They're the first Greeks, if you will. So make sure you know that in order. All right, on our map, we already have the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea labeled. So now we're going to label the island of Crete at the bottom of your map, and the city on that island is the capital city of Knossos. All right, the next group of people existed around 1200 BC, and they didn't live on the island of Crete, but they lived on the main peninsula or the mainland of Greece. They lived particularly in the city or capital city of Mycenae, and once again, you can see that on page 110. So the Mycenaeans lived for the next 700 years and dominated in this area of Greece. And so they are the second group of people we want to know. And you're going to need to label Mycenae. And that is the city next to the word Mycenae. So the dot right there. All right, so at this point in time, there was another city-state that existed across the Aegean Sea that was It was a strategic location. A lot of people tried to attack this city because it was on the Ilium into Asia Minor. It was a gateway from Europe into Asia Minor and Asia Minor back to Europe. And so it was a contested place fairly often. So this story, the Iliad, was written by Homer, and there are going to be about 30 people that you need to know. So make sure you're highlighting those people and you're studying them. Homer wrote the Iliad, which was about the Trojan War. Now, he was a blind poet, so he was basically writing the story based on what he had been told, obviously, since he was blind. But the Trojan War started because the Trojan prince named Paris had kidnapped Helen, and she was the beautiful wife of the Spartan king. And the Spartan king was brothers to King Agamemnon, and King Agamemnon decided, hey, he talked to his brother and he said, we can't let these Trojans just run all over us. If they're taking your wife, we need to fight back. And so because she was so beautiful, there's a quote that says, a face that could launch 1,000 ships. And really, it's literally what happened is thousands of Greek ships sailed across the Aegean Sea to attack Troy, and it was all over a woman, all over Helen. If you've seen the movie Troy, it depicts the fact that Helen ran off with Paris, but history books and in the Iliad, it depicts that she was actually kidnapped, left without, on her without her own wanting. The story, of course, with Troy is with the Trojan horse, that the Greeks weren't really being very successful because of the tall walls that were constructed. So they snuck in a horse. Well, they didn't sneak in a horse. They built a horse and they said, we're gone. And they snuck around the side of the Aegean Sea, and they thought it was an offering to the gods for peace. And it was built out of one of the ships of the Greeks that had sailed across the Aegean Sea. And of course, they opened it up and then attacked from the inside. So again, the Spartan king was King Menelaus, who, the King Agamemnon was the one that kind of convinced King Menelaus to go and fight them. And so the Odyssey was another epic poem that was written by Homer, and this was about the story of Odysseus and his ventures back to Greece after the Trojan War. And again, here it kind of just talks about his stories, talks about Homer, who was the poet that, wrote about these heroes and gods and so forth, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad was about the war, and the Odyssey was about the adventures of Odysseus's trip back home. And both the Iliad and the Odyssey are found in our library today, and many classrooms across the country read them. All right, so let's label Troy. It was across the Aegean Sea. That's where they had to launch the 1,000 ships, right? And so Troy is the city-state in Asia Minor. All right, the next group of people were the Dorians. They ruled for 400 years, and it was considered to be a dark age. In other words, not really much was going on. An alphabet was created. The Greek alphabet was created. Homer's poetry was written during the Dorian period, but it really didn't happen anything else. And nothing was invented, created, or started. And so the Dorians are number 3 on our list. So remember, you have the Minoans, you have the Mycenaeans, and then you have the Dorians. All right, and the last thing that we're going to talk about as far as evolution, and this is kind of how ancient Greece existed after this, was the rise of the polis. And a polis, or city and surrounding countryside, or city-state, is how Greece was ruled. And this was because of so many mountains. It really separated Greece, and they were never really united unless they fought, like in the Trojan War. Polis is the root for many words like police, policy, politics. It also ends words like Minneapolis, Annapolis, Indianapolis. And so anytime you see that as a prefix or a suffix, it deals with, and as I mentioned, the reason why the polis existed was because it was so mountainous, and within the valleys, independent city-states began to develop, and that's how it was. So this is number 4 for Greece. And when you look at all these city-states, you can tell. All right, seeds of democracy. We already mentioned that the word democracy was a contribution, but now we're going to talk about the real idea and the processes of democracy. So that too is a contribution. So we just mentioned at 750 BC, they were ruled by the polis. They didn't really have a united front. The only time that the Greeks ever united was during wartime. Greek armies were just average citizens. Um, they were more upper class than anything, but they needed more soldiers to protect. And so, if you're going to require more soldiers, they wanted to have more voice in the government. And so, the tyrants, who were ambitious aristocrats, they were rulers who seized power by using force. They went out and they colonized or settled other lands, and these revolts were led by these soldier citizens. Now, today's definition of tyrants is that it's a negative, um, oppressive leader kind of thing. In Greek times, it really wasn't that way. They were the ones that established all the red areas on this map. If it wasn't for them being ambitious and going out and colonizing and wanting to kind of have an area that they controlled, none of these other areas would have been colonized by Greece. All right, so one of those major city states was Athens, and Athens was known as a creative state. They invented a lot. They were deep thinkers. They really used their mind quite a bit. And so there were a few people that were the leaders of Athens that brought about democracy. So it didn't just boom exist. It needed kind of a process. So the first person in that process was Solon. And again, highlighted pink because there's 30 people that you need to know. He was the head of Athens government, and he used these crazy ideas saying, let's not force people into slavery just because they have debt. Starting to get equality, but not completely, because he didn't give land back to the poor that the rich had acquired, but he said, we can't force people into slavery simply because they can't pay their debts. Pisistratus was the next leader, and he was again another one of those tyrants, those ambitious aristocrats, that he did think that the next step in the process of equality was to give land back to the poor. The wealthy, of course, did not necessarily like that, and but it did start to create a little bit more equality. Later on, we'll talk about Pisistratus's contribution as far as culture, and that was that he sponsored the first drama festival. So we'll bring his name up once again. But in the evolution of democracy, it was Solon first, then it was Pisistratus, and so we'll label where Athens is, and then we'll continue about talking about other leaders. So Athens, same place that it is today. It's the capital of modern day Greece, and it's in the same location. So Athens is pretty much dead center there in your map. All right, so the third leader of Athens was Cleisthenes, and Cleisthenes created the Greek assembly. This Greek assembly was the lawmaking body. It was groups of people, 500 people, that were randomly chosen by a lottery, and any adult male citizen could be eligible to have his name put in the lottery. And it was this group of 500 people that made the laws that governed Greece. He also created an idea of ostracism. In other words, if there's a person that is personally trying to gain a lot of power and control, they're going to ostracize him. So they would banish them from Athens, usually for time periods like maybe up to 10 years. And now we use this word ostracism as if you kick out of your group or you kind of eliminate them from your clique. It's called ostracizing. The fourth and final Athenian leader that I want you to know in the evolution of democracy is Pericles. Athens had a full direct democracy where they elected the assembly instead of using that random lottery during his rule. Now, he ruled from 461 to 429, and it was called the Age of Pericles because it was considered to be the most dazzling era of Hellenic history. And he did things like he expanded the empire after the Persian War. Things were very peaceful. We weren't really fighting. So he could focus on things like democracy. So you have Solon, Pisistratus, Cleisthenes, and Pericles. Those are the four Athenian leaders that created this direct democracy. All right, turn to page 25 in your packets, and there is a chart, and we're going to compare Athens to Sparta, two of the most um, well-known city-states in ancient Greece. So in Athens, the political unit was a city-state, or a polis, as all Greece was governed by. They had a direct democracy. Now the difference here is we do not have a direct democracy because next election for president, they use the electoral college, and that just means it's represented based on population. So one vote doesn't equal one vote. In a direct democracy, it does. Military power, because Athens was very close to the sea, they had a strong navy. They encouraged trade. Not only did they make things to do trading, they also wanted to get things from other people. Colonization, they wanted you to go out and settle new lands. That map I showed you earlier with all the red areas, I wanted you to make sure that you contributed to their colonization. Sports, they had gymnastics and wrestling. Wrestling was actually a class in um, school, so the young boys learned to wrestle. The role of the individual, they wanted you to be free, have choices, think on your own, do all those things. And cultural life, as again, they wanted you to think on your own. They wanted you to create art, drama, new political ideas, and philosophy was also encouraged. All right, so let's talk about Sparta. Sparta, again, was completely different from Athens, and they developed a city-state that was very militaristic. They ran it like a boot camp. Um, they were settled by a group of people that were considered to be very warlike, and they were brave and courageous people, but they didn't have time to farm. So they did have slaves, and those slaves were called helots. And those were the Spartan farm laborers because all the young men were training to be a soldier. So helots is the Greek word meaning capture, which is why it would refer to slaves. So since the boys lived a boot camp life, they trained to become good warriors from the age of 7 to 21. They didn't have time for farming, and so that's why they had to have slaves do all of their farming. As I mentioned, they were brave and courageous, but they were too focused on military, so they didn't have any statues or temples or theories or epic poems at all from Sparta. So Sparta is on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It's the southernmost dot there on the mainland of Greece. So you can kind of see where Sparta is in relation to Athens. All right, on your chart, let's go over Sparta then. It too was a city-state or polis. They had a militaristic totalitarian government. That's just big fancy words meaning it's run like a military where one person is in charge and you do what they say. Military power, unlike Athens, they had a strong army, of foot soldiers, cavalry, things on land, not so much with a navy. Trade, they only traded what they needed to trade for. They didn't make a lot of things at all in Sparta to even trade with other people, but they did need some things, so they did do a little trading. Colonization, all right, as far as sports go, they had gymnastics like Athens did, but instead of wrestling, they were trained in military exercises, calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, those sorts of things for good, strong military personnel. The role of the individual was not important to Sparta. You were playing a role for the city-state of Sparta. So Sparta was the most important, and then the individual was second. So they didn't want you to think on your own. They wanted you to do what you were told. And so they didn't want this individual creative thinking. And so they kind of said, no, just don't think, we'll think for you. So what you need to do is answer the questions on page 25 and turn those in to class tomorrow. And don't forget to do that extra credit as well. All right, the Persian threat. We mentioned that Troy was a location that was highly contested, and that was what started the Trojan War. But there was also the Persian Wars, and the Persian Wars were from 500 to 400 BC, and there were 4 battles that we're going to not only talk about but also identify on our map. The first battle was the Battle of Marathon. When the Greeks won, they knew that they needed to announce their victory because the Persians came in under the rule of Darius the Great, and they were the ones that had the immortal army, and they had between 10,000 and 25,000 Persians that were going to try to attack them. So when they won, they sent. Okay, so the Battle of Marathon was the first of the Persian Wars, and it's also highlighted in green. We'll locate that on the map, and orange. Orange for the obvious reason that that was the invention of the marathon race, 26 miles, based upon the victory over the Persians. Second battle was at Thermopylae, and this was about 10 years after the Persians were defeated at Marathon. They gathered up more military soldiers. They had about 2 million Persians under the command of Xerxes that were going to fight the Greeks. Now, the whole battle at Thermopylae, they actually lost to the Persians, the Greeks did. However, most people are very familiar with the Battle of 300, whether it's from the book or from the movie. And in either one, it depicts that they won this particular small battle. And the illusion was that it was 300 Spartans fighting the Greeks. However, there were actually Thebians, Thespians, and other allies of Sparta as well. So there were about 300 Spartans, 900 allies, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebians. So people from Thebes, which we'll label on our map as well, helped the Spartans to defeat the Persians at that one battle. Again, overall, they lost the Battle of Thermopylae. At this point, the Persians had defeated the Greeks, and so the Athenians in Athens fled Athens because they feared that since they lost at Thermopylae, that they were going to come to Athens and attack Athens next. So people fled Athens and went to the island of Salamis. And it was at this point where this battle became a naval battle, not an army battle. And so the Greek navy, led by the Athenian navy, because they had a stronger navy, defeated the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. And then our last battle really wasn't much of a battle at all. It was pretty much the Greeks kicking the Persians out of their territory. And so the last battle was at Plataea, and this ended the Persian Wars, and the Greeks no longer had to worry about the Persians attacking them. So let's look at your map. We're going to label the battles, and we're also going to label the city-state of Thebes. The battles are the little explosions on the map. So the first one was at Marathon, and that is north of Athens, again, northeast of Athens, 26 miles, remember. And then the next battle was up north at Thermopylae. That's the battle that they lost. And then the Persians pushed southward towards Athens, and so the Athenians fled Athens and went to this little island right here of Salamis, and so that was the next battle. Thebes, remember, that was the people that helped the Spartans at the Battle of 300. So there's Salamis. So you have Marathon, Thermopylae, the city-state of Thebes, and then Salamis. And then the last battle was at Plataea, and that was the end to the Persian Wars. All right, so after the Persian Wars, Athens became this powerhouse. They became the head of the Greek Empire, and other city-states kind of paid them money to make sure that they were going to protect them. So after this point, businesses and trade grew, and they became a commercial dynasty. Any citizen could serve in public office. They no longer used this lottery system. They used a lot of money to replace the buildings and to build new ones like the Parthenon. The Parthenon was a temple built in 447 BC for Athena on the Acropolis, which means above the city. And so the Parthenon looks like this, and it's a perfect example of Greek architecture with symmetry. You can see the Acropolis is high above the city to protect Athens. Okay, so the Athenian greatness lasted for about 50 years, where they created a Delios League, and again, different city states kind of paid them for protection and so forth. And life was pretty good. In 431 BC, Athens and Sparta, who were complete opposites of the spectrum, really started having a lot of conflict. And so the Civil War lasted for 27 years between these two Greek city-states. It was fought primarily on the Peloponnesus Peninsula, where Sparta is located. And Sparta actually won this civil war, but Athens really has remained the center of the Greek culture. It's the capital today. So, because they were so well rounded, I think they kind of elevated up above Sparta, who was one minded and one thought process towards the military. Now, the Persian Wars earlier that I mentioned were recorded by Herodotus. The Peloponnesian Wars were written about by Thucydides. And the difference, remember, from those two people is the fact that Herodotus believed that the Greeks were fighting with their gods right beside them. There was a lot of myths that was involved as well as part of this war. With the Peloponnesian War or Civil War, Thucydides recorded it as is. So there was no idea that gods were fighting on either one of these sides. All right, so on our map, we've got a variety of city-states already labeled, the 4 battles, the 2 seas, the island of Crete. And so now we're going to label the Peloponnesus Peninsula, and it's that entire area there. You can see it's connected right here. So it's not really an island, but it looks like it almost could be an island. All right, moving on. Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic era, which began in about 335 BC. Alexander the Great was the son of Philip II of Macedonia, and although he was not a Greek, because he was tutored by Aristotle, he was Greek enough to be kind of considered to be a Greek leader. So when he controlled Greece and other areas, he was kind of considered Greek enough that they call it the Hellenistic era, even though they weren't really ruled by a technical Greek person. Alexander the Great conquered the largest empire in that the world had seen up to this point. He took the Greek and Macedonian armies and defeated the Persians, and he created a palace that or he lived in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And since he was Greek enough, there was a lot of blending of Eastern and Western influences because he conquered Persia and Egypt, and he went into India, and he conquered Greece, and of course Macedonia. So a lot of Greek education and ideas really advanced. The cities of Athens and Alexandria, Egypt, were kind of home bases for Greek knowledge and Greek education. So Alexandria, of course, was named after Alexander the Great. Now, he died at 33 years old. There's a lot of question about how he died. He didn't have a successor, so that was going to be an issue, but he was 1 month shy from being 33 years old. They're not sure if he was poisoned by a son. He was not sure. It's not sure if he had a malaria relapse because he had suffered from malaria earlier, or he did. He was well known for drinking quite a bit, so they're not sure if that was part of it either. Either way, it started spreading the idea of the Greek culture to more lands beyond Greece and Macedonia. So Alexander the Great, you can see this huge green shaded empire. This is all the area that he controlled, and it's listing different battles that I'm not going to have you know just because it wasn't necessarily Greek battles. All right, Greek gods and oracles. You've probably studied a little bit about this before. Greeks, of course, were polytheistic. They believed that gods were everywhere and caused everything to happen, good or bad. Each city state would build a temple or have a god or a goddess as their patron god or goddess that oversaw their cities. The gods were looked at as human like, and they got angry, they expressed happiness or love, and so they had a lot of the same human like emotions. The gods, of course, lived on Mount Olympus, which we'll label here in just a little bit, or you can look at page 135 in your book. And the oracles were the priest or priestesses that predicted the future. And Greeks, the leaders of Greeks, always went to the oracles to find out, should we start this battle? Are we going to win? Should we do this? Should we do that? And so they kind of were the ones that these priests and priestesses would talk to the gods. So it's kind of like the oracle bones of ancient China, where they wrote messages to the gods and then the priest, read the cracks. So all leaders always went to these oracles and really took it quite serious. They built temples for their gods and goddesses, as I mentioned. The Parthenon is a perfect example of that. It's in orange, as mentioned earlier, because it's a building that still exists. It's a good example of Greek architecture and religion. And once again, they didn't go to these temples to sit down and worship. They were only there as an honor or a tribute to the gods or goddesses. All right, so Mount Olympus is the only mountain on the list, so you can put that up there at the top by the triangle. All right, moving along. There are lots of Greek gods and goddesses, and you've probably studied a little mythology throughout your education at some point. We're just going to do the 12 major gods that are mentioned in the reading. Mythology, of course, is not only a word that is Greek because it ends in ology, but the whole idea of studying Greek myths is something that we do in our school. So the first one is Zeus, and of course, he was at the top. He was the king of all gods. He controlled the weather, and of course, the thunderbolt was his symbol. The Olympics were created in his honor, so that's another contribution. Aphrodite was the goddess of beauty and love. And I'm sure you've heard of things like an aphrodisiac, something that, like chocolate, for example, they use as an aphrodisiac. They say it kind of, gets you in the mood for romance. Apollo was god of the sun. He was the patron of archery, music, prophecy, and medicine. So the Hippocratic Oath has the symbol of Apollo as one of its, designs. And of course, we use things like, the space mission Apollo 13, named after that. Ares, the god of war. Ares was the patron god of Sparta, of course, makes sense. So he was the god of war and combat, just fighting all in general. Artemis was a goddess, and she was the goddess of the moon. She was also a guardian of the cities, young animals, women, and hunting. Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, was the goddess of wisdom. And it makes sense that Athens was a location that really encouraged education and wanted this creative thought because Athena was the goddess that oversaw them. Demeter was the goddess of crops, grains, fruits, and agriculture. Dionysus was the god of fertility, joyous life, hospitality, wild things, and wine. Sounds like a fun kind of god, right? Hephaestus was the only ugly god. Remember, Greeks in their paintings and sculptures always portrayed people and gods as perfect specimens. Well, Hephaestus was the only one that was depicted as ugly. He was the god of fire and forage and all artisans. Hera, goddess, not necessarily even a goddess, more like a protectress of marriage, since she was the wife of Zeus. She was also the protectress of children and the home. Hermes was the god of orators and writers and commerce, protector of thieves and mischief makers, the guardian of wayfarers, the messenger to mortals. So Hermes with the winged shoe, of course, is his symbol, and we use that today for track. Poseidon is the god of the seas and the ocean, and he was also the earth giver of horses to mortals. And so a lot of statues depict him with horses and, of course, are typically in water fountains. Education in Greece. Of course, in Athens, it was different than in Sparta, different than in Corinth, and so forth. But there were 4 cycles, and the education phase was in the first 2 phases of life. The pois and the ephebi, those were the childhood and the youth. The hour was the man, and the geron is the elder. And geron is a prefix referring to older people, like gerontology is the study of the aging body, or geritol is a vitamin for people that are 65 and older. Young boys, their education, they started at 6 or 7. They went to private schools because they were the wealthy upper class boys, and these schools consisted of anywhere from 60 to 100 boys. Slaves were the really ones that monitored their schoolwork, not their parents. So slaves would walk them to and from school. They would make sure that they got their work done and that they were behaving. So what was school like? They sat on a typical bench. They used a stylus and a wax-coated tablet. They did use paper, but that was only for really special events. The wax-coated tablet, really, you just kind of etched with the stylus into it, and so you just scratched out what you were doing, the math problems or the poetry or whatever you were writing. Started at 7 in the morning, and it pretty much lasted most of the day and into the afternoon. All right, what subjects were they taught? Of course, reading and writing in Greek. They were taught arithmetic, and this was used with an abacus, which I'm not really a firm understander of what goes on with the abacus, but I think Mr. Parson actually has one and he could probably explain that to you. But it's the ancient form of a calculator. They learned to play a musical instrument, the double flute called the analos. They would sing songs, recite Homer's poetry from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then after age 12, they did all those same things, but now they added wrestling. As I mentioned, it was an important school for them. They went to the palestra, which is the Greek word for gymnasium, because the word gymnasium is actually Latin. They were learning to wrestle, to swim, and to use a bow and arrow. And clearly, this was helping them prepare to be a soldier. So after 15 and 16, they concentrated on more a physical program to definitely prepare them for war. So running, jumping, hunting, of course, with the bow and arrow, driving war chariots, hurling the javelin. And that's, of course, where the Olympics come into play as well. They were also taught oratory because these upper class men were probably going to be involved in politics, so they needed to be good at public speaking. They learned different things in science that we learned with all those people dealing with, the circumference of the earth and all the other people that we mentioned earlier. And philosophy, again, that love of wisdom and that deep thought. And then, of course, history, especially Greek history, but other history as well. Once they get to 18 or 21, they entered the Athenian Soldiers League, and this was a 2-year kind of a police service, if you will. They protected the borders and they kept order at Athens. They really didn't go off to war until after 21. And so this was kind of preparation for that. So the idea of the police and the word for police are both Greek. Girls, of course, were taught the domestic sciences. Cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, but they also learned to read and write in Greek. They only did reckoning, which was very simple mathematics. Spinning and weaving, of course, was important, and embroidering. They would get to sing and dance and maybe play an instrument or recite some poetry. Sparta women had it much better. Sparta women could actually participate in athletic exercises. They had a lot more equality than other Greek women. And again, they wanted strong Spartan women to give birth to strong Spartan boys. And if they didn't give birth to a strong boy, they sometimes left the babies out in the woods and they were done because they weren't going to be good enough soldiers for them. All right, so let's label the rest of the map. We need to label the city of Delphi, which we will talk about in the movie or in the film about the Olympics. Olympia, of course, and Corinth. All right, so watch or read pages 12 through 14, and then we're going to watch the Greek Olympic video and we'll do a worksheet along with that.